Good morning and good evening to everyone joining us from Washington to Seoul to West Coast and other parts of the world. Welcome to the conference, Avoiding Meltdowns and Blackouts, Confidence Building and Inter-Korean Engagement on Nuclear Safety and Energy Development. My name is Sumi Terry. I'm the director of the Asia Program and the Korea Center at the Wilson Center. First, I want to thank our co-sponsor for this event, our colleagues from the Institute of Far Eastern Studies at the Kyungnam University. And I also want to thank the Ministry of Unification for making this project possible. I'm going to first turn it over to Dr. Lee Kwan-se, Director of IFES, for his opening remarks. Dr. Lee is both the Director of IFES and a Chair Professor of the Graduate School of North Korean Studies at Kyungnam University. He has in the past served in numerous key posts in the Ministry of Unification, including the 17th Vice Minister of Unification. He also served as a representative in the 18th, 19th, and 20th Inter-Korean Ministerial Talks and was the head of the advanced team for the Inter-Korean Summit. Clearly, Dr. Lee has an extensive experience in inter-Korean engagement and talks. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours for your opening remarks.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Good morning and good evening to everyone. I'm very pleased to meet you all. I am Director Lee Kwan-seo of IFES Kyungnam University. It is very meaningful that we are hosting the meeting with WWC, the most prestigious center in the United States. Researchers from both countries will have in-depth discussion based on the research result on nuclear safety and energy development issues. Once again, this is very significant. I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Director Sumi Terry of WWICS for leading researchers to conduct outstanding research. This research project is supported by the Ministry of Unification of Republic of Korea and is being organized by IFES, Institute for Far Eastern Studies. WWC has long-standing relations with IFES. We co-hosted numerous seminars in various fields, including Cold War research. Academic exchanges between the two sides have been maintained for a long time. It is early morning in the United States and late evening in Korea. I know that many participants are joining today at this webinar. Hopefully, through productive discussion, I hope that we can produce in-depth research result. Once again, thank you very much, all the researchers who have participated in this study project, and also thank the Korean experts who are joining us, though it is quite late in the evening. Thank you.
Thank you for your remarks. You know, North Korea's nuclear program has been, of course, a thorn in the side of 5 American presidents now, some approaching sometimes crisis levels, sometimes receding to secondary importance. In recent months, we have seen tensions rising again, as we saw, we are seeing renewed missile tests and preparations possibly for the 7th nuclear test. But we need to also remember that North Korea usually follows periods of tensions such as this one, with periods of outreach as well. So in this difficult time, the inter-Korean relations, especially in cooperation with the United States, I think still remains a potential platform to prevent a dangerous escalation of tensions on the Korean Peninsula, should a window of opportunity present itself. So with this in mind, we launched this project with IFES, bringing together US and South Korean experts on nuclear energy and safety. Their forthcoming book, stay tuned for that, explores key challenges and possible opportunities as well in inter-Korean engagement on nuclear energy and safety on the Korean Peninsula. So again, thank you, Dr. Lee, for your remarks. We'll move on to the first panel. I would like to first introduce, let me first talk about the format a little bit. We're going to hear from the key authors of this volume that I just talked about. Each author will have about 7 to 10 minutes of remarks with a little extra time for the second panel. to present their key summaries and highlights from their chapters, which will be followed by commentary from our Korean colleagues. So now with that, I'm going to turn over to my colleague from the Wilson Center, Kayla Orta, who really has been instrumental in bringing this project together. She has really spearheaded this project in coordination with our IFES colleagues. So please, Kayla, take over for panel 1.
Thank you, Sue, and thank you, Director Lee and our colleagues at IFES Kyungnam University. We're very grateful for the time, energy, support, and effort that went into making this event possible. I now invite our panel 1 speakers to please turn on their cameras and unmute their, mute their microphones until I'm ready to speak. So please remain muted, but please turn on your cameras. And I will begin with the initiation of panel 1. So without further ado, we will kick off our first panel. While the second panel today will feature commentary on nonproliferation and the future ahead, the first panel will be a deep dive into discussion on nuclear energy and safety on the Korean Peninsula. To begin, I will introduce our 3 main panelists who will be hearing approximately 7 to 10-minute remarks from, during which they will highlight key takeaways from their respective chapters. I will then pass the torch to our 2 Korean colleagues for their comments and questions. Lastly, to wrap up the panel, we'll circle back to each author to hear their responses, and if given enough time, we'll have some opportunity for Q&A as well as their final thoughts. Because we have an ambitious agenda and we'll be hearing from many distinguished colleagues, I ask that all speakers keep their stipulated time. So first, please allow me to introduce our main authors and panelists for this discussion. Up first is Professor Mansung Im. Dr. Im is professor in the Department of Nuclear and Quantum Engineering at the Korea Advanced Institute of Science and Technology, KAIST. He is also the director of the Nonproliferation Education and Research Center, which houses an excellent program for building next-gen capacity for young academics and policymakers. The title of his chapter is Nuclear Energy in North Korea, Benefits, Risk, and Possibilities. And through this chapter, he explores what is often largely overlooked in recent dealings with North Korea, especially in the nuclear proliferation challenge, and that is the establishment of North Korea's national energy infrastructure, and in particular, what opportunities, possibilities, long-term in the future may exist for nuclear power and technology. Following his presentation, we will hear from Dr. Ho-Ki Kim. Professor Kim is a professor in the International Nuclear Safety School, INSS, of the Korea Institute of Nuclear Safety. He has worked and assisted with nuclear safety review of power plants, including during the Korean Peninsula Energy Development Organization, KEDO's light water reactor project in North Korea. He has also worked directly with the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. We're very lucky to have him join, given his years of experience directly working in the field and working with major international organizations. The title of his chapter is South Korea's Nuclear Safety Collaboration: What Lessons Can Be Learned from One of the World's Leading Nuclear Energy Developers. And through this chapter, he offered a comprehensive analysis of nuclear safety structures in both North and South Korea, and what potential avenues exist for cooperation moving forward. Last but not least on this panel, we will also hear from our author, Dr. Francesca Giovannini. Dr. Giovannini is the Executive Director of the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. Previously, Dr. Giovannini served as Strategy and Policy Officer to the Executive Secretary of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization, the CTBTO, based in Vienna. In that capacity, she oversaw the promotion of the CTBT ratification as a confidence-building mechanism in the regional and bilateral nuclear negotiations. Francesca's title for her chapter is A Disaster in Waiting or Simple Paranoia, examining the status of nuclear safety in North Korea and the factors that might strengthen it. Through her chapter, she helps bring to light key areas that are risk factors for the North Korean regime domestically and internationally, as well as what areas exist for potential motivation for the regime to take nuclear safety and energy concerns seriously. So with this introduction, I will now invite our panelists to speak. The order will follow how I've done the bios. So Dr. Im, the virtual floor, so to speak, is yours. Please feel free to begin when ready. You have 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Kayla, and thank you, Dr. Sumiteri, for this great opportunity, and thank you for all the audience for this opportunity to present my talk. So let me start with this question. Is denuclearization of North Korea impossibility? Shall we accept North Korea as a nuclear weapon state or nuclear armed state and talk about disarmament? Some scholars argue that talking about North Korea's denuclearization is pointless or even meaningless at this point. If we accept North Korea as a de facto nuclear weapon state, reunification of Korean Peninsula becomes a futile dream. North Korea's nuclear weapon becomes the biggest obstacle to peace progress in the Korean Peninsula and real existential threat to South Korea, security threat to South Korea, Japan, even the United States. Under the context, denuclearization is a goal South Koreans cannot give up. As an optimist, I personally believe that someday North Korea's denuclearization will be a reality. Then at this point, how can we start? You start with knowing what your enemy wants. According to the 2019 CIA World Factbook, only 26% of North Koreans has access to electricity. Many households are restricted 2 hours per day electricity use. They have a chronic energy crisis, threatening the sustainability of the industry. Simply put, North Korea wants energy. Although failed, the previous Kido project, which lasted from 1994 through 2006, demonstrated how much North Korea wanted nuclear power. At the same time, North Korea wants regime stability and economic prosperity. So we cannot just give North Korea what they want. But the possible path toward denuclearization may open up with possibilities of developing nuclear infrastructure in North Korea. Such possibilities now also discussed in the US policy community, including NTI, Harvard Pepper Center, etc. Although such idea of giving nuclear power, nuclear reactor to North Korea in exchange for nuclear weapon was a big no-no item until even recently. Wait a minute. Haven't we always failed in our past negotiations with North Korea? Hasn't North Korea always taken advantage of any cooperation dialogue to their unilateral benefit? South Korea, US has almost always become a loser in their deals with North Korea. Then how can we do it differently this time? Any new dialogue or attempt for North Korea's denuclearization should be based on a premise that North Korea is sincere and will make a credible effort. We need at least an opportunity for North Korea to demonstrate such intention or will. In this context, I suggest that we begin to talk about having a multi-stage, multi-phase nuclear power project. The project can be envisioned to include different stages, like 4 stages of progressive civil nuclear power expansion, starting with research reactor, experimental light water reactor project, small modular reactor development, and large LWR project. North Korean nuclear capabilities at a mature technical level with highly skilled workforce built over the years. According to Alex Montgomery, North Korea reached a current stage of technology maturity through successive diffusion and innovation and revolution of nuclear technology. Therefore, only under the absolute assurance of achieving security and prosperity, North Korea will consider the path of denuclearization. Simply put, North Korea cannot trust the entities involved. At the same time, we cannot trust North Korea. We need a process of trust building or confidence building where we can test the real intention of the parties involved and make progress step by step. We know that North Korea will never reveal the list of nuclear facilities until they are absolutely sure about what they are getting. The nature of nuclear energy project involves high upfront cost, long construction time, and need for international support for plant operation, presenting opportunities for continued engagement. Such engagement also opens ways to understand the other party's long-term preference and vision. The new North Korean nuclear project can also include the small-scale North Korean version of megatons to megawatt and be implemented step by step by demanding North Korea to follow up with relevant actions for each stage. Based on my sort of back of the envelope calculation, it takes about 12 years to use North Korea's HEU inventory to run the research reactor. that could be a good time period to demonstrate North Korea's sincere approach to this approach. In other words, progress in nuclear energy projects should commensurate to denuclearization progress made by North Korea and significance of respective achievement made by participating parties. Denuclearization measures that needs to be include freezing nuclear and long-range missile tests, freezing all nuclear programs, monitoring and inspecting nuclear program activities, declaring the end of pursuit of nuclear program, shutting down Yongbyang facility, deactivating and dismantling HEU, disclosing information, scrapping all new facilities, and executing complete dismantlement, etc., and etc. To support implementation of these measures, technologies to verify the success of each milestone should be carefully identified and utilized. These technologies reflect the recent progress of scientific community, including activities such as virtual inspection, probabilistic method, a nodal monitoring system, blockchain, and etc. The specifics of these verification programs need to be tailored or varied depending on the acceptability of gaining access to the facilities and items. In this regard, partial coverage over space, facilities, and a range of nuclear activities and materials could be applied at the early phase of verification. And depending on the progress and success in nuclear energy project and denuclearization, various reward to North Korea can be also implemented, such as lifting sanctions, providing economic benefit, including the infrastructure development for electric grid, and the signing non-aggression pact, normalizing relations, and maybe eventually signing peace treaty, and also encouraging or requiring North Korea to join NPT and basically abiding by international norm. At the same time, we need to learn from the past. The path we want to take needs to be really carefully designed based on the lessons we learned from our previous effort. The Kido project, the old approach of techno diplomacy, was a project started impromptu without a proper careful preparation. The project had no political and financial commitment from the governments involved. And there were no real step-by-step measures, milestones, roadmap set up and implemented. So the lessons from the Kido project should be carefully utilized in this new effort. This new approach requires close coordination and cooperation between the United States and South Korea and other allies, maximally utilizing respective strengths of each party. The proposed nuclear power project, if executed successfully, will open opportunities for rebuilding North Korea toward peace, prosperity, establishment in the Korean Peninsula. This also allows the achievement of low carbon energy system in Korean Peninsula toward the global goal of decarbonization, carbon neutrality, and sustainability. The new Korean Peninsula, if all these projects can be successfully implemented, will be a model of hope and vision for the global community. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Excellent, Professor Im. Well kept to the time exactly. We definitely appreciate your remarks. We will turn over to our next panelist now to keep things moving forward. So Dr. Kim, it is now your turn. The floor is yours. Please keep your remarks to about 10 minutes.
One more again. With my work, I am always specifically 이상 잠시만요.
Please bear with me for a moment. I must turn off the interpretation.
With my work, I'm always specifically reviewed how to handle the topic of safety or collaboration between Korea through an investigation of both sides' nuclear safety capacities. First, I presented the background of the inter-Korean engagement of safety capacity building, touching on global normative framework toward global safety and security harmonization. This highlights national capacity or competencies for nuclear safety management. Then I described the competency of nuclear safety management of South Korea in terms of the history of capacity buildings, importance of consistent government policies, regulatory demands accompanied by the continued deployment of nuclear power plants, and global contributions of nuclear safety regulation. Since 2008, KIS has established international nuclear safety schools and launched such project as support for the three regions of Asia, Arab, and Africa, bilateral support tests for welcomer countries, and KIS has joined international nuclear safety master degree program. In the survey, KIS experience with TEDO project was discussed, along with the TEDO agreement regarding the nuclear safety components of nuclear power plant and the training of North Korea's electric staffs. KIS attempted to confirm nuclear safety on the peninsula and to establish a coherent regulatory infrastructure between the two Koreas. The training of North Korea regulator was not within the keynote scope of supply to North Korea. However, this was newly added to KIS agreement to assist North Korea's regulators in safety regulation during operations after negotiations with KIS. For the construction of the LWL plants, KIS performed a 14-month safety reviews and provided safety evaluation report and presentation workshop for North Korean regulators in August 2001. Then North Korea issued the construction permit to Kido in September 1st, 2001. Also, the first orientation was performed in July 2002 at KIS, inviting 25 North Korean regulatory staffs for about 1 month. After many discussions with North Korea about the necessity of regulatory training, North Korea's intention to participate in orientation was not notified at the end of December 2001. KIS continued orientation until the termination of the project in the form of joint inspection with North Korea's regulators for nuclear power plant construction activities. Then North Korea nuclear-related laws were reviewed, and the detailed areas of item of Korea's collaboration for safety were suggested. North Korea's laws are written in a declarative and concise manners, and all the details to implement law are entrusted to the administrative organizations the law designates. There's no details are available at the moment. In 2011, North Korea legislated the Act on the Prevention of Radioactive Contaminations. This provides the basis for nuclear safety management and shows the meaning of framework for safety management. Considering North Korea's specified authority decision-making structures and their policy of prioritizing government use ahead of safety, global society needs to emphasize so that North Korea's regulator has actual status and exert authority for nuclear safety management. This is to support their capacity building toward the global goal of the safety and security harmonization. In the political and diplomatic sectors of the Korea and global societies, there is a common perception to be created to make nuclear safety and regulatory capacity one of the cooperation topics in North Korea. Integrating these sides of the first recommendation for inter-Korean engagement in nuclear safety management suggests to create a collaborative framework for nuclear safety on Korean Peninsula. It is necessary for the two Koreas to establish an integrated legal and institutional system, develop capacity for nuclear safety regulations, and seek ways to operate and manage and equipment for radiation safety. The way to support North Korea is organized into 3 categories: capacity building of North Korea through its own changes and collaboration with South Korea. Global society's role in the process of seeking gradual improvement of the situation surrounding North Korea, and the role of Korean relations in the process. Of course, it is preferable North Korea to take lead in developing their own capacities, and the global resource could let be available. This is for North Korea to return as a responsible member of global societies, cooperate under global normative framework, and develop capacity. North Korea needs a shift in policy from military use of nuclear power to its use for peaceful purposes. During the process, South Korea will be the most effective partners. In reality, without a major shift in sanction, it is difficult to expect inter-Korean engagement on nuclear safety, North Korea's nuclear issues. Since nuclear safety management is rooted in the basic human lives of securing safety for the pursuit of happiness, although it is cautious, it will be considered a subject of inter-Korean engagement with international cooperation of North Korea, apart from the international situation. This open approach toward global nuclear safety raises expectations that it could also contribute to the formation of internal deterrence, albeit limited, in the context of North Korea's military use of nuclear power, and be another leverage in talking with them. Also, North Korea is a non-member state, a method to create and allow an international atmosphere in which North Korea can utilize the infrastructure to deliberate. Also, suggested that international politics and diplomacy deals with nuclear safety as a topic of cooperation with North Korea. Considering the tendency of authority concentration toward the upper level in North Korea regimes and their nuclear use, in order to their level to have the authority to actually cooperate with the outside world, global society needs to work together to emphasize the importance of its independence and empowerment. Global society needs to take an interest in North Korea's nuclear safety and urge the role of the lever. When the two Koreas move forward on the path of extending collaborations, they could jointly study and establish an integration strategies and prepare the details accordingly. Collaboration on nuclear safety with North Korea should focus on sharing practical experience. This engagement is to support securing the independence and authority of North Korea regulated, build nuclear safety infrastructure in the professional, and promote conversion and disposal of nuclear-related facilities, and meet international safety standards at facilities and test sites. Thank you for your attention.
Excellent, Professor Kim. Also, perfection on the timing. When we do hear remarks again, if you could hold the mic a little bit closer, I think that will also help with the interpreters so we can have your responses from the discussants. I think your point on North Korea's Nuclear Safety Commission and independence and authority is very important, and I hope we'll get into that in the discussion in a moment. But now we will switch over to Francesca Giovannini's presentation. So we've given each of our panelists 10 minutes to speak. Please try to stick to that marker, but the floor is yours. I think you're still muted. And Professor Kim, could you mute again, please?
Thank you so much, Kyla and Sue, and thanks a lot to the Woodrow Wilson Center for including me in this great project. So my paper actually stems from 2 observations. There are 2 positions that are often taken when it comes to North Korea nuclear safety. The first one is an impression of absolute impending catastrophe, that the program is mismanaged, that the leadership is irresponsible, and basically we are just, an accident away from happening, with the world basically just standing as a passive bystander. The second general observation is that nuclear safety is often treated, especially by policymakers, as an easy way out. When we think about how to engage with very complicated political issues, often people think that technical issues like cooperation on nuclear safety is an easy way in, right? Nuclear safety, it's possible, it's plausible. Who wouldn't want to collaborate on nuclear safety? And therefore, nuclear safety does provide a possibility for a first engagement with countries that might be politically very problematic. I have encountered this oversimplification of technical issues, in particular when I was working for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty Organization. And the idea is, look, the technical cooperation is easier than political cooperation. And my paper takes a look at both statements and argue that actually the two observations are actually quite different from the reality we're finding on the ground. More specifically, the nuclear safety conditions in North Korea are vulnerable. There are some concerns for sure. There are some vulnerabilities that Professor Sigeker and others have pointed out throughout the years. But the situation is not catastrophic, and we are not just at an impending, situation where everything is going to collapse, and most of the region will actually then be paying the consequences of transnational radiations. The second observation I have is that nuclear safety is as technical as it is political, and therefore the belief of policymakers that just by offering nuclear safety cooperation with North Korea will lead to political engagements, I think is quite an illusion. And it has to be critically examined to understand, what can work and what cannot work in the context of North Korea. Now, let me mention a couple of things on the first point, which is what is the situation of nuclear safety in North Korea? So I've looked at a series of reports. I've actually scouted a little bit the literature. I've actually gone in the second draft also over some of the Chinese sources that I actually not accessed in the first round. I think there is a convergence that there are vulnerabilities in the nuclear program, and many nuclear programs have similar concerns. I've actually created a typology of nuclear safety risks, and in particular, I found five that somehow cut across the literature. Certainly the risk of reactor overheating, environmental damages and contamination leaks. Then there is a primitive regulatory framework and some unsophisticated infrastructures, possible flawed safety design because most of the program is indigenous and it doesn't necessarily benefit from international engagement. And then finally, some hazards related to plutonium management. I think you would say these are the 5 common nuclear safety risks that have identified by American, South Korean, Japanese, and Chinese experts. But I also have to say that in the record that I found and I read, for most of these nuclear safety risks, North Korea has actually tried to manage and put in place some containment strategies. Now, some are more primitive than others, some might not be effective as others, but that demonstrates North Korea is fully aware of some of its safety concerns, and it intends somehow to put in place some preliminary strategies. I want to give you the example of the risk of reactor overheating. This is particularly true under many circumstances. Well, one is in particular the fact that the river adjacent to the nuclear complex has a stream of water that is actually quite unreliable. And so the North Koreans have actually built, this is also reported by SIG in his last visit report, has actually started building a system of dams that try somehow to make the flow and the stream of water more predictable and in a more regular pattern. And that shows in a way the concerns and the awareness of their own vulnerabilities. Now, for me, the question of whether North Korea cares about nuclear safety or not is a resounding yes. Yes, they do care about nuclear safety, and they are concerned about nuclear accidents. And I found 4 drivers that actually put the North Koreans at the center of these nuclear safety concerns. The first one is there is no doubt that the regime of the North Korea regime has been increasingly in the most recent past built on what I would call techno-nationalism prestige. There is a very clear prestige around technological development being at the forefront of investments. This has been a very clear narrative of Chairman Kim Jong-un, and therefore a catastrophic accident at the pinnacle of their technological development will be incredibly costly, both domestically and internationally in terms of prestige. The second most important driver is that North Korea desperately needs nuclear energy in order to supply these enormous energy deficiencies that the country has. And therefore, an accident would definitely set them back years. It would actually somehow damage, probably almost irremediably, their energy grid. The third concern that brings them to be more aware and more active on nuclear safety is certainly the concern over China and the transboundary issues. Now, China and North Korea have very complicated relationships, but the Chinese have actually expressed deep concerns, especially on the consequences of nuclear testing, the earthquakes that are actually then, somehow shaking also the Chinese communities. And I think the North Koreans have all the interest in making sure that no transboundary accidents actually spill over into China. And the final driver that has kept nuclear safety as part of North Korea considerations is definitely the legacy of Kido, which I know Professor Kim has talked about. So Kido had been able to put in place a series of infrastructures, a series of protocols that the North Koreans have maintained. And therefore has instilled a sort of international standards of nuclear safety into the country, and also a tradition of international cooperation that, albeit limited, does remain in place in North Korea. So this tradition of protocols of management of nuclear safety has been instilled, and I think it's still part of the culture. Now, can nuclear safety cooperation help? This is my second and last point. As I said, I think nuclear safety is as technical as political because it requires countries to be willing to disclose to other countries their vulnerabilities and therefore allow these countries to have an inside look into their technical capabilities. So I think for every policymaker, North Korea, United States, or any other countries, there are three main questions that these countries need to ask whether they want to engage on nuclear safety cooperation. One is, what vulnerabilities will I have to disclose if I engage in nuclear safety cooperation? The second is, how much data about my technical capabilities will actually be acquired or gained by my cooperating partner, and how can it be misused? And the third question will be, how will cooperation on nuclear safety be read domestically? What will my audience think about cooperation with the United States or with South Koreans or Japan or whatever? So these are three questions, in my view, the policymakers in any country will ask, and that makes nuclear safety a costly decision. It's not an easy decision to cooperate on nuclear safety. I want to leave you with three observations I have. I have then, tried to organize the typology of nuclear risks, nuclear safety risks in North Korea based on two important elements. How much vulnerability will North Korea have to disclose whether they choose to cooperate on one of the nuclear safety concerns? And in addition, how important or urgent is this nuclear safety concern for the North Koreans? Based on that, I have actually come to three main conclusions. The first one is, it seems to me that the obvious is that nuclear safety on high priorities, but low vulnerabilities, data disclosure issues will actually be most likely. So an urgent safety issue, but that does not imply for North Korea to disclose much of their data and much of their technical capabilities will be probably the way to go. And one of the issues, for example, could be environmental radiation cleanup, something that might be done by a team of experts, but doesn't necessarily lead into understanding the technical capabilities of the countries. Second is bilateral cooperation on very narrow and specific common issues is the way to go. South Korea and North Korea share a concern about nuclear waste management. That could be also a potential entry point. And finally, I do think that there is a limited role for traditional international organizations because they are actually too grounded in very legalistic mandate of safeguarding, monitoring, and verification. But there is a way to create transnational ad hoc initiatives. I suggested, for example, an engagement with the Gulf countries that have actually thought very, very carefully about how to manage water stream in order to actually ensure the cooling system to be maintained, consistent. And so that could be a way, for example, between the UAE and North Korea, something that we have not thought about, but could actually be explored. Final point, I think the United States has a limited but essential role. I don't see the United States costly, politically, domestically being able to engage with North Korea anytime soon directly. But I think the United States will be fundamental in granting other countries the possibility of engaging with North Korea, giving them a window of opportunity into a potential cooperation outlet. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Francesca. That was excellent, going through all the major points. I think we'll be circling back to your typology most definitely in the discussion. But now I want to, cognizant of time, pull in our discussants. So now that we've heard from each of the panelists, we will welcome Professor Lee Byung-chul for 5 to 7 minute remarks. He is an expert on all things Korea and nuclear, both North and South, and he joins us from Kyungnam University. And to follow his remarks, we'll hear from Professor Kim Dong-yeop from the University of North Korean Studies, who also heads the North Korean Nuclear Issues Center at IFES Kyungnam University. So we are very lucky to have both of these experts with us today to offer their thoughts and feedback and questions to our panelists. So we'll hear from both. Panelists, please take note of any questions or comments you would like to make, and then we'll circle back to you after you hear from both discussants. So Professor Lee, the floor is yours.
네, 경남대학교 국동문제연구소 이병철입니다.
Hello everyone, I am
먼저 이렇게
Byung-chul
기회를
Lee
주셔서 대단히
from IFES
감사드립니다.
Kyungnam University.
사실
Thank you
오늘
very
임만수
much for giving
교수님하고
this
김목영
opportunity.
전반희 박사님 말씀
Well,
잘
it was
들었고요.
great to
저는
hear
사실은
presentation
이거부터
by
한
Professor Lim, Dr.
28년 전,
Kim, and
그러니까
Executive Director
1994년에 이제
Giovanni.
우리가 흔히 말하는 제네바
1994,
우리드 프레임워크라는 게
Geneva
이제 만들어졌지
Agreement or
않습니까?
Geneva Agreed
그에 따라
Framework
가지고 이제
was
경수로
established in
북한에다가
1994,
경수로 2기를 이제
and constructions of
건설하고
2
그리고
light
뭐
water reactors
나중에는
were
2.13
done
합의에
in
따른
accordance with the
국유를 이제
Geneva
100만
Agreed
톤을
Framework
지원하는 것들은 우리가
and
이야기를 하게
supported 1
됩니다.
million ton of
그러나
heavy
이때
oil
제가
in
알기로는
accordance
가장
with the
큰
agreement.
전제는
However, here
북한이
comes the
핵시설을
premises
불능화해야 한다는
that
전제가
North
있었습니다.
Korea must
그러나
disable
사실은
the nuclear
아시는 대로
facilities. But as you
경수로
know,
사업은
in return for disabling
사업
its nuclear
공정률이
facility, North Korea is supposed to get
34.5%에서
LWR.
중단되고 마는
However,
사실상의
the project
실패한 그
completion rate was
프로젝트로 끝나게 되지
suspended.
않습니까?
So
여기에는
light
이제
water reactor
북한인도
project was
어긴
total
것도 있고
failure
그리고 뭐
because
미국도
North
거기에
Korea
대해서
did
상응하는
not
뭐
comply with its commitment
지켜지지
of
않은 것도 저는 있다고 봅니다.
disabling
뭐
nuclear
일방적으로
facilities.
북한이다,
But
일방적으로
also there
미국이다
are other
따지면 탓할 수 없지만
issues.
어쨌든
Of
시도
course, we
프로젝트는
cannot
저는
point
실패를
finger
했다고
who's
봅니다.
responsible for
그러다
that.
보니까
But
2005년 7월
overall,
한국
KEDO
정부는
project
북한이 핵 폐기
converting North Korean nuclear
합의하면은
facility into nuclear power
독자적으로
plant has completely
200만
failed.
킬로와트의 전력을 북한에 송전하겠다는 것을 이제 발표를 하게 됩니다.
Recently, South
사실은
Korean
아시는
government
대로
announced that
북한의
it would
이제
independently
송배전
transmit
인프라가
2 million
붕괴되었기
kilowatts of
때문에
electricity to North
전력을
Korea. If
최종
North Korea agreed
소비자까지
to
전달할
dismantle
수가
its nuclear
사실은 없습니다.
program, that
아시는 대로
announcement
북한의
was made in
인프라는 것은
July
굉장히 낙후되기
2005.
때문에
Because North Korea's
우리가
transmission and
전력을
distribution infrastructure
제공하려고
collapsed,
해도 제대로
electricity could
전달할 수
not be
있는
delivered
송배전
to
시설이
the
굉장히
final
낙후되어 있다는 게
destination.
사실입니다.
The
그러다
large-scale
보니까
transmission and
송배전망을
distribution
깔기
network that
위해서는
connects all of
상당히
North
많은
Korea
건설
is
비용, 뭐 여기는
estimated to
아마
cost
수십억
billions
달러가 저는
of
소요될 걸로
dollars
추정합니다.
in construction alone.
그리고 이보다 더 심각한 문제는
And more serious problem
남한에
than
있던 이제
cost
한국이 이제
is
24개인데
that
원자력
South
발전소를 이제
Korea,
가동하고
we have
있는데요.
24
이
nuclear power
발전소가
plants being
사실은
operated,
중앙
but
집중식 에너지
actually
체제와
in
그
South
자본을
Korea, we have a
북한을 그대로
centralized energy
적용하기에는
system
저는 굉장히
centered
좀
on large
한계가
power
있을 거라
plants,
생각이 됩니다.
and
북한의
energy
시스템하고
capital
한국이
cannot
지니고
be
있는 시스템이
immediately
동일하지 않기
applied
때문에
to North Korea
여기에도
as it is
송배전선은
in
여러
South
가지가
Korea.
저는 문제가 있을 거라고 저는 봅니다.
I believe that
그렇다면
transmission distribution
남북
network
에너지 협력을 우리가
is
미래
actually
지향적인
non-existent in North
관점에서
Korea.
본다면 어떻게
So,
접근해야 될 건가라는 이제
inter-Korean
우리가
energy
고민을
cooperation
하게
should be
됩니다.
approached from
여기에서 뭐
future-oriented
임만승 교수님,
sustainability
조반희 박사님
perspective.
그리고 김옥영
Well,
하기가
Professor Lim,
원자력을
Dr.
저는
Kim,
이야기
and
많은 분들이
Executive
이제
Director
원자력하고 이야기하고
Giovannini talked a
있지만은
lot about nuclear power
과연
plant, but
북한에
my question
원자력을
is, we need
제공하는 게
to think
과연
about how we can
최고의
establish
최선의
sustainable energy system
방식인지
on the Korean
물론
Peninsula.
조반희 박사님도
Is
말씀하셨습니다만
building
북한이
nuclear power
간절히
plant the
원하는
best
거는
option? Of course,
에너지이고 그
as
에너지를
Dr.
가장
Giovanni
효율적으로
mentioned, North Korea
할 수 있는 방법은
desperately needs
원자력이 가장
energy,
뭐 효율성이
and
높은 건
nuclear power plant has the
사실입니다만은
highest
과연
efficiency
우리가
in terms
북한에
of
제공할 수
getting
있는
or
방법이
generating
과연
the
원자력
electricity.
말고
But
다른 것은
can we have
없는가라는
other
게 저는 한번
options
우리가
other
고민을
than
해봐야 되겠다라는
building nuclear
생각이
power
듭니다.
plant? We need
이런
to work
차원에서
on that.
본다면은
In light of
남북
that,
에너지
I'd like to make
협력의
a few
장기적인
comments.
목표는 어찌
So,
보면은
the inter-Korean energy
원자력이라기보다는
cooperation
좀 지속
goal,
가능한
instead of
한국과 이제
focusing
남한과
or
북한이 지속
restricting our
가능한 에너지
attentions to
체제를 구축해야
building
되지
nuclear power plant,
않을까라는
we need to
측면을 저는
think about other
하지
things,
않을 수가
like
없습니다.
other
이런
energy
측면에서
sources can be
본다면은
our options.
재생
In light of that,
에너지를
I
좀
believe
우리가
renewable energy could
고려해야
be
되는
our
것도 생각해보지
option.
않을 수가 있습니다. 사실 재생 에너지라는 것은
Because
에너지의
what is
분산 행위
renewable
가능하기 때문에
energy?
원자력하고 다르게
It's
다른 장점이 저는
it can
있다고
be
봅니다.
distributed
그래서
unlike
북한에다가 재생
nuclear
에너지를
power plant.
제공하는 것을 우리가 좀 전향적으로
We can definitely
고려한다면은
distribute
현재
it,
우리가 지니고 있는
and
안보 문제 그리고
I
신뢰
believe
문제도
that
조금 해결할 수 있지
if
않을까라는
sustainable
생각이
energy
듭니다.
system is to be built in the
덧붙여서
Korean
우리가 이제
Peninsula,
북한의 이제
definitely we
비핵화
can do that by
관련해가지고
establishing a
많은
regional
한국인
decentralized energy
전문가들은
system
북한
centered on
비핵화
renewable
사실상
energy
물
and providing
건너갔다라고
renewable energy
이야기를
to
많이
North
합니다.
Korea.
저도
South
거기에
Korean
대해서
renewable
처음에는
energy industry could
북한의
also get
비핵화가
benefit.
굉장히
And
낙관적으로 저는 생각을 사실은
denuclearization is something
했더랬습니다.
that
그러나 최근에 육사
is like an
핵실험을
illusion.
거쳐서
People say that,
최근에
but
이제
and also
트럼프
North Korea
김정은 회담이
keep
결렬되고
conducting
최근에 북한이 보여주는
nuclear
일련의 어떤
missile
태도를
tests,
보면은
etc. But if
굉장히
you look at
비관적인
closely what they
전망이
are
저는
doing,
가깝다고 봅니다.
yes, there are a
굉장히
lot of
우리가
pessimistic
궁극적으로는
views,
북한
but
비핵화를 목표로
eventually
가져가야 되겠지만은
we need to make sure that our
중장기적으로 볼
ultimate
때에
goal is
북한의 비핵화는
nuclear
어찌 보면 굉장히 좀
weapons
달성하기가
disablement
어렵지 않나라는
or
생각이
a total
됩니다.
scrap
그런
of that.
차원에서 볼 때 저는 임만석
In light
교수님께
of
한 가지
that,
질문을
I have one
이제
question
드리고
to Professor
싶습니다.
Lim of KAIST.
임만석 교수님이 아까 이제 발표하실 때
Professor Lim, when
북한에다가
you make a presentation,
북한식
you mentioned that
SMR이라고 이제 말씀을
nuclear
하셨는데
style
사실
SMR should be
임
provided.
교수님이
And
말씀하시는
Professor Lim, when you
북한식
say
SMR이
SMR
어떤
or North Korean
것인지 좀
style
궁금합니다.
SMR,
사실은
what are you
SMR이라는 게
applying?
한국
Because what
내에서도
is
전 세계적으로
SMR,
아직까지는
small
뭐
module
실용
nuclear
단계화,
reactor,
실용화
is
단계가
in
되고 있지
the pilot
않은데
stage.
그
I mean, it's
실용화되지
not being
않은
commercialized
SMR을
yet, even in Korea,
북한에다가
which is quite
어떻게
advanced
적용할 수
in nuclear
있을지
power
그
plant. But
방법이 저는
how are
궁금합니다.
you suggesting that
그리고 두
we need
번째로
to
이제 김호기
apply
박사님은 북한의
North Korean
안전에
style SMR?
대해서 이제
Now,
뭐
Dr. Kim
전문가시고
Ho-gi, you
말씀해
are
주셨는데
true sense of expert in
김호기
nuclear safety.
박사님이
However,
생각하시는
from your
북한의
own
어떤
perspective,
안전,
Dr. Kim,
북한 뭐 전문가들 안전에 대한
the
인식,
nuclear
일종의
safety
퍼셉션이라
in North
그럴까요?
Korea,
문화,
what
거기에
kind of
대해서는
perception do
어떻게
you have toward
평가하시는지
North Korea?
거기에서
What is your
궁금하고
assessment? What is
유관희
your take on
박사님에
North Korean
대해서는 뭐
nuclear
많은
safety?
다양하게 말씀을
And Executive Director
해주셨는데
Giovanni, since
만약에
you had
북한이
made a great
비핵화가
presentation, my
이렇게
question is,
달성한다는 게
North
이게
Korea
불가능하다면은
cannot
우리가
achieve
그렇다면 북한에 제공해
disarmament
줄 수
or
있는 에너지
denuclearization at all, then
방법은 없는
what
것인지
should be our
거기에
ways to
대해서 제가
provide
여쭤보고
energy
싶습니다.
to North
예, 제
Korea? Do
토론은
you think that
여기서
there's no
마치도록
way at
하겠습니다.
all to provide
감사합니다.
energy to North Korea? That's the end of my discussion. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Professor Lee. I think you gave us quite a bit to think about as that trickles down into our panelists' notes, and they can follow up on that momentarily. We'll switch over to our next discussant for his notes as well. Professor Kim, the floor is yours.
예, 안녕하십니까.
Yes, hello. I'm Kim Dong-yeop. Can you all hear me well? Yes, perfect. Today, I'm not a nuclear technician. I'm rather a international politician, and I'm a scholar of international studies and related more to policies. So I don't think I could talk a lot about technology, and I learned a lot about the technical side. I listened to the 3 presentations, and from my understanding, North Korea's nuclear energy cooperation could be one area that we could think of. And the next area that we could consider is about the nuclear safety in North Korea. Just as Professor Giovanni mentioned, it could either be a disaster or something else. And I think we should divide these 2 areas when you understand the North Korean nuclear issue. On the one hand, there's a demand or need for energy in North Korea, which could lead to energy-related cooperation. And the next could be a cooperation on the nuclear safety side. I think we could consider cooperation in these 2 areas. But I like to redirect us to a more fundamental issue, because nuclear energy development or the safety cooperation, on the other hand, well, we talk about the North Korean nuclear issue or the denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. I want to know whether linking these 2 are actually possible. Professor Lee Byung-chul also mentioned just now that we already somewhat doubt the possibility of denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula. On the other hand, Dr. Kim Ho-gi was somewhat more optimistic, and I do still do not want to lose my hope on the denuclearization. And as I listened to the 3 presentations, you all made brief comments on this, whether it's on nuclear energy development or safety cooperation. You all mentioned that its relationship with the denuclearization, if it is possible, if the linkage or connection is possible, I believe that it requires a more specific and detailed planning. Professor Lim gave a brief proposal on that. Already in 1994, we have the agreed framework, the Geneva Agreed Framework. Back then, North Korea did not have nuclear weapons, but now North Korea declared it is in the possession of nuclear weapons. What I'm most concerned is not only about the completion of nuclear weapons, but above all, the most worrisome of all is that North Korea completely gave up its expectations for the US and also for South Korea in 2019 in Hanoi. And so I think this issue could be prolonged, not only in just 1 or 2 years, it could go over 5 to 10 years, impacting not only its dialogue with US, but also its dialogue with South Korea. And so we have to think when the timing will come, when the dialogue could be resumed. And for that, I think we have to consider the rivalry between US and China. If this is resolved or is weakened, we could see a possibility. But as the tension or rivalry between US and China escalates, I think this issue of denuclearization or the issue of nuclear safety cooperation is something that we might have to wait for a long period of time. But nevertheless, I personally want to say that the denuclearization or the nuclear issue of North Korea, whether it's energy development or safety cooperation, I don't think it would be that wise to link the two too closely, because if you try to link the two too closely, it might end up losing both of them. Of course, our long-term goal is, or ultimate goal is denuclearization. But, well, Professor Lim or Professor Kim was somewhat optimistic and somewhat Professor Giovanni as well. I don't understand that you singled out nuclear safety cooperation as the only means to motivate North Korea for cooperation. And I want to say that if we limit our scope to motivating North Korea with nuclear safety cooperation, it will not end up successfully, because we have to think, what does North Korea fundamentally want? Is it energy support? Is it the sanction relief? Well, I'm a North Korean scholar, so I don't think it is these two fundamental goals. What is the ultimate goal? It is regime stabilization in the long run. So, just as professors mentioned, when you think of energy development and the nuclear safety cooperation, if we want to propose that as a kind of a compensation, I believe North Korea will not respond to that. But that doesn't mean that we should give up these two. Of course, we should pursue denuclearization. And just as Dr. Lee Byung-chul mentioned, there could be other possibilities. But North Korea's, considering current infrastructure or technology of North Korea and other concerns or uranium level, I do believe that safety cooperation is a feasible method, but how should we pursue the two pathways? The two shouldn't interrupt each other. We should maybe pursue two tracks so that both could be in a win-win situation to create a kind of a link between the two. I think that would be a more practical way. Of course, I don't have the detailed planning or proposal, but that is my personal belief. And so economically, we shouldn't try to fit into the denuclearization goal for North Korea. If we think we could think of deterring any escalation of nuclear activities, I think stabilization could be one possible solution. And also another thing is about personnel. I think this is a very crucial issue. Considering the scientists that were involved in nuclear development in North Korea, I think that is very numerous, about 3,000 to 5,000, and the more core experts are around 300 in number, from my knowledge. For these nuclear experts, we could consider how they could be relocated for energy cooperation or safety cooperation. And this is also very clearly linked with the so-called irreversible denuclearization issue that US talks about. Whether it's a nuclear energy cooperative development or safety cooperation, I think the issue of managing the North Korean nuclear exports is a top priority, is one of the top priorities. And I don't actually have a question to the presenters, but in my comments, I believe that my questions are somewhat embedded. And so to ask one final question, during the 2007 Six Party Talk, I remember taking part. I think it was in August 2007, the North Korean leader Kim Gae-gan said that during the South-North bilateral meeting, said that if we have the political will of the US as in India, we can deal with North Korea as an exception with the NPT system. And Kim Gae-gan mentioned the Bush administration, US and India Civil Nuclear Cooperation Initiative. Of course, the context is different between North Korea of today and India of that time. But when we think of energy cooperation or safety cooperation, we may refer to the Indian case. Of course, not in the same manner. We may not copy it, be able to copy it, but we could at least refer to it. That I'd like to conclude. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Kim. I think those were some excellent comments as well. The final point about the case study analysis with US-India is a good case in point. I think your mention of personnel goes back a little bit to what Professor Ho-Ki Kim also mentioned in his paper. So now we have about 10 minutes remaining. We had some questions, but I think we will save that for post-event activities. What we'll focus on right now is allowing each of the main author panelists, 3 speakers, to run through to give final remarks and responses to discussants. Please have about 2 to 3 minute remarks. We'll go down through the list and respond to the excellent points that Professor Lee and Professor Kim provided. So Professor Im, it is your first.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. Thank you for the comments and questions. I think as many of us agree and already observed, so if we don't do anything, what happened? North Korea will continue to build their nuclear weapons. Their capability increases as well as their strategies evolve. And then that becomes bigger threat. And they change their basically tactic against South Korea and other allies. And situation becomes worse and worse. So the point is we need to do something. Say if we have a chance to meet, then where do we start? What are we going to talk about? Well, we talked about keto, but keto was a project without any preparation. It started with a sort of a casual conversation among US diplomats or bureaucrats. And then parties got recruited. I think we need to be prepared. The point is we need to be prepared with very well thought out processes step by step. Dr. Lee's point about renewable energy, that is very important. But then point about my research director and LWR, I mean, SMRs and etc. That is exactly how to address the issue of distributed energy. So small SMRs or research directors can be part of this development as part of this staged development. The renewable energy can be actually a synergistic energy source with SMRs. So it actually presents an opportunity for low carbon energy system development. Nuclear power and renewable energy can work together. Renewable energy alone cannot make a system sustainable because of the intermittency presented. I will not get into the details. The SMRs can be also deployed in different stages. For example, the initial stage can be barge-mounted or ship-mounted SMR. In other words, you have an SMR already built, but basically located near the harbor of North Korean city, and then provide electricity. Because SMR is a relatively small size, maybe that requires smaller upgrade of local electric grid. But then we can also build SMRs as we move on with these different stages. This SMR can include smart that can be actually constructed, although it has not been built yet, but it is a ready plant. Or we can go with NuScale or ISMR, the US version or South Korean version of more advanced SMR. I think these things basically presents an opportunity to reveal the energy system of North Korea, but this also becomes a part of this roadmap, which requires very serious deliberation. But anyway, I'll stop there.
Professor Kim, I don't think your audio is coming through. Professor Kim, I think the audio is not working again. No, unfortunately, we still cannot hear you. No, we might, maybe while we are troubleshooting the audio for Professor Kim, we might switch over to Francesca very quickly, and we can troubleshoot Professor Kim in the meantime.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank both discussants for this excellent set of comments. And I think both pointed out very, very clearly that there are, this, as also Sig Hacker has commented multiple times. I mean, this is nuclear program in North Korea really is a dual program, right? There are serious civilian concerns over energy security and they need to be addressed. Is energy cooperation at large, independent from nuclear, feasible? I take what Mansung said very, very seriously. I think yes, but it's really important that we, embed this into a much broader roadmap, because the politicization of this issue right now would not lend itself necessarily to successful attempts, right? In proposing energy cooperation on renewable would probably be read by North Korea as an attempt yet again to put pressure on denuclearization and, and disarmament. I find it also very, something that Professor Kim said, which I think is very true. In my paper, I actually stated very clearly that, look, let's not create an illusion about what nuclear safety can do. Nuclear safety cooperation is not a panacea for everything. And nuclear safety gets you into a beginning of a cooperation stage, but it does not lend you all the way to political discussions, right? And so for years, we've thought these technical cooperation issues might ultimately end up into confidence building, trust building. These are incredibly long processes that very rarely actually lead to an actual political cooperation down the line. So I think it's important that if we approach nuclear safety cooperation, we do that with the right expectations, which is not leading up to disarmament of North Korea, but it does mean that the international community as a whole has taken seriously as a responsibility nuclear safety as an obligation of the entire international community. Last point I want to make, which I think is really important, is the management of scientists. This is, to me, is the most political issue of all. Because we've talked about this a lot also in the former Soviet Union, for example. Sigek has worked a lot on this, what to do, for example, with the Iranian scientists. I mean, these are really, really difficult issues that to me make nuclear safety cooperation really political. And I think there can be no discussion over what to do with the nuclear expertise of the scientists without a much bigger and much broader political engagement. This will be too sensitive. But I finish with this. I think there is a role to play for science. In science diplomacy, the scientist to scientist engagement, the SIG and others have been engaged with in the former Soviet Union, does land some important openings. And perhaps we have not explored it enough. Maybe we should give this a chance. Again, it doesn't have to be the US scientist. It can be scientists from international organizations, from transnational coalitions that bring in the expertise needed to make the program safer and maybe a little bit more open to international cooperation. Thank you.
Thank you.
내가 해도 되겠습니까?
So may I speak now?
Yes, please.
First of all, personally, for Professor Kim Dong-hyuk, I agree to many of the comments related to, I'm not a North Korean nuclear expert. However, related to the light water reactor project, I have engaged with the North Korean personnel and I have my experience on that. And based on that experience, I also had my personal interest And so let me share a couple of my broad observations. Nuclear energy for North Korea could be understood as a source for regime sustenance. And of course, there could be other motivations for the nuclear issue resolution. But if you focus only on the nuclear energy, I think that could be the only possible way. So that is why I agree much with Professor Kim Dong-yeop and related to North Korea's nuclear threat that was mentioned. As we train the North Korean experts, we discussed the appropriate number of such experts. And we also try to think how we could take advantage of these expert pool. So what comes to my mind is the North Korean nuclear experts could be relocated to the safety area or for inter-Korean cooperation projects if that is feasible. That entire pool of experts could be relocated to the South Korean facilities of nuclear energy. And that was another opportunity that we could think about. So in terms of leveraging the human resources or experts, I think we have many opportunities. And as I listened to Professor Lee Byung-chul, related to the perception of safety in North Korea, up to now, in the process of negotiating with North Korea, what I discovered is that there is the SNRC, which is the regulatory body of nuclear safety, but it was very difficult to identify who belonged to this regulatory body. But after the power plant was built and was put into operation, we continuously emphasize the need to have a regulatory framework for safety. And we worked very hard to create a consensus on the part of the North Korean counterparts and for them to accept on the need of safety regulation. And it took a lot of time and effort. And in that process, we could also witness that the North Korean personnel were added. In the beginning, 25 North Korean experts were invited to North Korea for training. And out of and for these 25 experts, we believe are the main personnel that are currently in charge of the nuclear safety regulation in North Korea. In 2011, North Korea enacted a new Nuclear Safety Act. It is a very brief and simple in its stipulations, but I still believe that it does function as a basic legislation for the regulation of safety. And for those that were involved in the safety regulation of North Korea, this legislation also reflected the safety issues that we have communicated to North Korea in the past. So we believe there is a certain level of personnel that are capable of safety regulation. And for the regulatory body, we currently don't have any means to confirm whether the regulatory body is functioning effectively or not currently. With that, I'd like to conclude.
Wonderful. Thank you, Professor Kim. Wanted to make sure that you had plenty of time for comments, given that we are juggling through all the speakers. However, we are going to transition now to the second panel. Because this is virtual, it is normally the point where the moderator asks the audience to give a round of applause for our excellent panelists and discussants. And unfortunately, we don't have the audience in the room to hear, but there is a round of applause. I think our discussants gave our panelists fantastic feedback and much food for thought. I believe we'll be having good conversations about this afterwards. And thank you again to our panelists for joining us early and late as it is. And now, Sue, I will hand it off to you for panel 2.
Thank you, Kayla. Really excellent panel. I wish we could just continue that discussion much longer, But in the interest of time, let's now move on to the second panel. As a reminder, each author, each presenter will speak about 10 minutes and each discussant will speak about 7 minutes. I will now introduce our two panelists. Both are the leading experts on North Korea's nuclear program and really needs no introduction to this community. I will do so anyway, very briefly. Dr. Sek Hecker is a professor emeritus in the Department of Management, Science, and Engineering at Stanford University and a senior fellow emeritus at Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies. As we all know, Dr. Hecker has a unique experience also having visited North Korea frequently to assess plutonium program at the Yongbyon Nuclear Scientific Research Center. Dr. Hecker also brings a broader perspective. He's worked on many decades fostering international cooperation on nuclear energy, nuclear safety, security, and non-proliferation, and has worked extensively with also the Russian and Chinese nuclear laboratories to enhance safety and security of their nuclear assets as well. His paper is on nuclear cooperation with North Korea. Is it desirable? Is it possible? The second panelist is Dr. Jeffrey Lewis. Dr. Jeffrey Lewis is director of the East Asia Non-Proliferation Program at the James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies, Monterey Institute of International Studies. He's not only a leading expert on North Korea program, he's also a leading expert on arms control issues in Northeast Asia in general, Chinese nuclear policy. He's the founder of the armscontrolwonk.com, the leading blog and podcast on disarmament, arms control, and non-proliferation. If you have not checked it out, it's really a must. And Dr. Lewis's paper is on safeguarding energy-driven engagement on the Korean Peninsula. He delves deep into the history of nuclear energy and weapons program on the Korean Peninsula. So with that, we'll now first hear from Dr. Hecker. Dr. Hecker, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Terry, and good evening, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to join this group, and particularly to join the discussion that you've already had. Just a matter of update, Dr. Terry, I've now officially retired from Stanford University, and I've taken up a sort of a co-brothership with Jeffrey Lewis at the James Martin Center in Monterey, as well as with Texas A&M University Nuclear Engineering Department. So as you said, I tried to examine, is cooperation desirable and is it possible? The desirable answer is very easy. Yes, it's desirable. In the nuclear sphere, internationally, cooperation is essential. Is it possible? Well, as you turned and said right at the very beginning of this session, is that, right now, things, of course, really look quite grim in terms of cooperation. However, as you pointed out, the times of crisis in North Korea have typically been followed by outreach and times of opportunity. So we've been through similar situations to the difficulties that we see today. For example, in my opinion, the year 2017 was one of the most dangerous. That was the first year of the Trump administration, when things, quite frankly, looked just dire. Yet that 2017 was followed by Singapore and the outreach at Singapore. And Kim Jong-un then managed to follow what I consider was the pattern of the Kim dynasty, and that is to try to reach strategic accommodation with the United States. And so that then followed for the next year or so. Unfortunately, it fell apart at Hanoi. My concern is that as I've looked back over the history of all of this, and by the way, I've tried to capture all of this, and most of you know, I've been working on a book on North Korea. I've now finished that book, and it should be out by Stanford Press in a couple of months' time. In the past, that strategic accommodation was always there. And my concern is that today, it may not be there anymore. And particularly if we look back actually to the Xi Jinping-Putin summit back in February of this year, and then everything that's happened since, it looks like that Kim Jong-un has taken a very strong turn, towards Russia and China. So it's going to be really quite difficult. And therefore, the message to Washington and to the Biden administration that it's going to take a more concerted effort today to try to bring North Korea back to the negotiating table, more concerted effort than the administration has been able to put together to date. So now let me turn to, is nuclear cooperation, possible? As I said, today, it looks pretty bad, but we should be ready. And all of the speakers have already pointed that out. And I think that's certainly the case. We've also heard about the lessons from the past, for instance, the keto experience. And what I did, as you've just pointed out, Dr. Terry, since I've worked a lot with the Russians, also with the Chinese, but with the Russians especially, I've actually, in this chapter, laid out what we've gone through in cooperation from back in the Soviet times when things were pretty difficult politically, to then the dissolution of the Soviet Union and Russia, where we did, megatons to megawatts, cooperative threat reduction, all of those things. And I laid out what was actually possible and sort of what lessons that we learned. I also talk a bit about keto, and I talk about the other times where we had cooperation between the United States and North Korea, like the 2007 and 2008 times. So in terms of looking then ahead as to what's possible, what I did in the chapter was to lay out sort of four scenarios, four potential political scenarios, and then look at what's possible under those scenarios. The first one is the current situation, which is one where any dialogue, any cooperation looks to be very difficult, if not impossible. However, even under those circumstances, again, what experience points out, particularly back from the Soviet days, is the dialogue, some type of dialogue is absolutely essential. And if we see what's happened during the past week, where we had the potential of really coming close to misunderstandings between the South and the North and the US and the North, is one at least needs to set up a hotline in order to be able to deal with those uncertainties and the surprises and so forth. One also in the current situation needs to tackle the issue, what if some sort of emergency, particularly a nuclear emergency arises? We need to be able to work together, and that has to sort of be laid out, I think, at this particular time. And then I think particularly looking at the current situation in Ukraine and Russia's taking over, attacking, and then taking over the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, is that instead of going in that direction, we should take a page from India and Pakistan, who in 1998 actually made an agreement to say we're not going to attack each other's nuclear installation. Something like that could be done even under the current political situation, and I very strongly advise that we move in that direction. The two sort of in-between scenarios before I get to the possible scenario of cooperation would be if we again get into a situation of a freeze, or perhaps a freeze, followed by disablement. There are a number of things, a number of steps that we could take with the North Koreans, and I lay those out. To get to the sort of most desirable part of the political spectrum is that we actually get back to a real negotiation. Then what I've suggested there is a concept that I call cooperative conversion. So instead of a focus on just denuclearization, and quite frankly, I don't know exactly what denuclearization means. Does it mean nothing nuclear in North Korea at all? So instead of going in that direction, I advocate and I lay out a path towards cooperative conversion of the North's military nuclear and missile program to a civilian nuclear and space program. And in that, one can capture much of what the first panel actually discussed, helping out, moving North Korea in the direction of nuclear energy. And it would be a step-by-step process. And that starts with look, first of all, stop. One again would have to freeze, the program that they currently have, then begin to roll back in a step-by-step process, and then eventually, eliminate the nuclear weapons in North Korea. Well, by the way, when you do that, that also takes care of the people problem that was just discussed in panel number 1, is the nuclear people indeed can be turned over, from the military to the civilian establishment. And as Dr. Yim pointed out, a sensible approach would be to go towards the small modular reactors and move in that direction. So let me then just end with saying a reason that the US should push in this direction is that if indeed North Korea today will want to go still in the direction of more nuclear power, and my colleague Jeffrey Lewis will make a good case for that, then I think it would be much better for the United States to be there to work with North Korea in conjunction with the United States and South Korea to provide nuclear power for North, then to have them turn to China and or Russia. Because once they do that, the nuclear cooperation, moving towards nuclear power, you're making a commitment of decades and not just years. So my concern is if North Korea then would actually move in the direction of China and Russia for nuclear power, that is going to make nuclear cooperation very, very difficult for the United States for decades. And that's why we should actually move now. Let me stop there. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Hecker. You mentioned certainly nuclear cooperation is desirable, but is it possible? And we both mentioned that history of dealing with North Korea does show that time of crisis has turned to time of opportunity. You, for example, remind us about what happened in 2017 with the year of tensions and escalation has turned to year of symmetry and diplomacy in 2018. But I do agree with you. You would take much more considered effort by the Biden administration to bring the North Koreans back to the dialogue this time. But thank you for talking about your full potential political scenarios. Your point about realizing the benefits of nuclear energy, cooperation, avoiding just worst potential consequences, for that to happen. We just need essentially, we need dialogue. And that's, in case of an emergency, in case of a nuclear emergency, setting up a hotline, and so on. And I like your example of India and Pakistan as well, just that agreement and agreeing not to attack each other's installations. And then just instead of focusing on just denuclearization, path towards cooperative convergence, helping North Korea move towards civilian nuclear energy, step-by-step process, and then roll back and hopefully eliminate. Thank you for that. Now we turn to Dr. Lewis, who examined safeguards and other non-proliferation measures that should be implemented on Korean Peninsula over time. Dr. Lewis, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate being invited to write this paper. There are a few reasons. One is that for the first time in a long time, I got to write a paper about North Korea where I didn't have to argue about whether denuclearization was feasible or not. And so taking a break from that argument was a real welcome relief for me. As you've already heard, I organized my paper around the question of whether we could safeguard nuclear energy cooperation with North Korea. And safeguards is a word that has a very specific technical meaning, and I broaden that a little bit to really ask the question of what kinds of technical strategies and measures might we take that would allow that energy cooperation to occur. And as I did that, I really wanted to be agnostic about what kind of cooperation might be on the table. So I wanted to be open to a variety of outcomes, whether that was a very traditional non-proliferation deal like we saw under the agreed framework, or whether it was something which, I'll be honest, I think is more likely which is something that much more resembles the nuclear deal that India was able to get, where there was some effort to try to separate the civilian and energy program from the overall military program. But I wanted to really just be general and open, because although I think at the moment it seems very unlikely that we're likely to engage in energy cooperation, I also think it's quite unlikely that those nuclear weapons and those concerns are going to go away by themselves. And so I think, like many other people on these panels, I believe that we will eventually return to talking to the North Koreans. And in that context, energy cooperation is going to be something that will come up. And I'm hoping that the paper makes some small contribution to that discussion of what technical measures and strategies we might pursue to allow that cooperation to proceed and to work. Now, when I started writing this paper, I had two intuitions. Both of my intuitions turned out to be wrong. So full disclosure, sometimes you start writing a paper thinking one thing and you finish writing the paper with another thought. But I'll share those two intuitions with you. The first intuition was that motives would matter. I had this idea that North Korea turned out the way it did because they wanted nuclear weapons much more than South Korea. And so that may have been a big part of the story, and that might inform our strategies and technical measures. And the second thing is I thought that certain types of measures would be better than others, that we might really have to pay a lot of technical attention to the details of cooperation in order to design the best form of cooperation, the one that we could implement most effectively. And that in particular is a very American kind of way of looking at a problem. It's very common in the United States to emphasize how important the technical details are, how important verification and monitoring would be. We'll have endless meetings about, which particular type of light water reactor would be most appropriate for a particular situation. And not to spoil the paper, but the answer is I think I was wrong on both accounts. That my fundamental observation is that the way we think about motives is wrong. It's a much more complex and rich story than that. And the other thing is the technical measures don't truly matter all that much, in the sense that we actually have a wealth of technical strategies and safeguards available to us, and we can sort of choose those to fit whatever energy cooperation issue we want to deal with. So the general conclusion of the paper, which I'll talk about just a wee bit more to talk about those two things in turn, but the general conclusion of the paper is that the real issues continue to be political, and that if we can find political solutions, the technical solutions are there for us. The way in which I went about reaching this conclusion, my kind of general method, was to take a historical and comparative examination of safeguards and other technical strategies on the Korean Peninsula, starting with what we might call the nuclearization of the peninsula in the 1970s, when both South Korea and North Korea began nuclear energy programs, both of which I think had strong elements of weapons behind them. I really, one of the two big takeaways of the paper is really that we often, I think about motives in the wrong way. We ask, well, did the North Koreans do this because they wanted energy? Did they do this because they wanted weapons? And I think the real answer for both South Korea and North Korea is sort of both and neither. And it's both in the sense that I think in both cases, there was and always is a mix of motives. Even when a state is committed not at the moment to building nuclear weapons, there's a certain amount of hedging going on. And I also say it's neither because I think it's maybe too simple to imagine that policymakers say, well, I have an energy problem and I want an energy solution, or I have a security problem and I want a weapons solution. Policymakers, and I think we see this very clearly in both South Korea, especially under Park Chung-hee, but then also North Korea under Kim Il-sung, they have to be experts on everything. And so they need to be experts on energy and security and all kinds of domestic problems. And my experience, and I think the scholarship bears this out for those two countries, is they often have very simple ideas about the world that inform how they go about making decisions. And I think in both the cases of South Korea and North Korea, both then and I would say even today, both countries have a broad commitment to modernizing and growing their economies based around the idea of integrating technology. And so I think if you had sat Park Chung-hee down, or you had sat Kim Il-sung down and you said, you know, why do you want nuclear energy, or why do you want nuclear capabilities? They wouldn't immediately say security or energy, right? I think they would talk about how important it was to acquire modern industrial capabilities. And then if you asked, well, so what would you do with it? Then they might tell you about energy. And then if you then turn around and said, well, you know, isn't there a security piece? They would say, well, that too, right? But I think that we have to sort of firmly keep in mind that nuclear capabilities for both of these countries, and I would say then and now, you know, it's not just a simple, well, I have to go to the store and buy a battery idea, right? It's a much more complex and rich notion of how technology integrates into a country's overall capabilities. The paper then also reviews U.S. strategies in order to technical strategies in order to reduce proliferation. And the U.S. has really had just one strategy the whole time, and it applied it to both South and North Korea, right? It was trying to encourage those countries to build relatively proliferation-resistant reactors, preferring light water reactors, trying to discourage them from pursuing enrichment and reprocessing, and ultimately encouraging technical safeguards administered by the IAEA. There are other ideas that have been kicked around, multinational arrangements, letting the parties inspect themselves as Argentina and Brazil do. But there really has not been a great diversity in strategy. And the argument I would make is that the strategy worked, or it was a good strategy, or it was an optimal strategy. It worked in the case of South Korea. It didn't work in the case of North Korea. But ultimately, I don't think that that was a technical problem. You know, so the third part of the paper, as I kind of walk through the different technical strategies, the third theme of the paper is sort of explaining why they succeed and why they fail. And ultimately, the sort of second big idea of the paper, right, which is the other intuition that's wrong, is at the end of the day, the technical measures don't matter, right? That the reality is that the U.S. strategy worked fine for South Korea, and probably would have worked for North Korea if the political situation had been different, but it was not. Right? And maybe in the discussion, we can talk about why that political situation was different. But ultimately, this was not a problem of safeguards. Right? The IAEA administered safeguards in both countries. It detected very serious safeguards violations in both countries. And so, you know, my general takeaway is that whatever kind of energy cooperation that we want to agree to from a political sense, right? Whatever form of cooperation we think is viable because of the dominant political factors, we can safeguard that, right? There are technical measures that are available, and those will, I think, in their strength and scope, fundamentally exceed what we need on a technical basis. The problem will always fundamentally be political, and so that is where we are going to have to put our energy. So I don't know if that's a good news or a bad news paper. You know, the good news is if we come up with an agreement, I can imagine how we could safeguard it. The bad news is that our problems remain fundamentally the same, which is to say our inability to reach a fundamental political accommodation. You know, and that suggests that this is not something I can easily solve just with technical measures. Thank you.
Wow, thank you for your remarks. You certainly gave us a lot to think about. You focus on what kind of strategy and tactical measures we can take for energy cooperation to occur. You mentioned at the outset that you wanted to remain agnostic. I applaud you for that, and you are open to a variety of outcomes. You mentioned that you had two intuitions. The first was that motives matter, and the secondly, that technical details matter, verification monitoring, and so on. I'm struck by your comment that you're wrong on both accounts, because if I'm very candid, I think I instinctively also shared your two intuitions, right? So I'm really struck by your point that the way we think about the motives and technical details is just not quite the right way to think about it, that the real issue remains political, and that if we can find political solutions, technical solutions are there for us. So I don't know either whether it's a good news or bad news, but fundamental issue being, reaching political accommodation. That's a tall challenge. But thank you for that. Now we are here from our two discussants who will speak about 7 minutes each. Dr. Gina Kim. Dr. Kim is a professor at Korean University of Foreign Studies. She previously served as a chief of the North Korean Military Division at Korea Institute for Defense Analysis and adjunct professor at Yonsei Graduate School of International Studies. We will then hear from Dr. Hwang, who is professor of international relations at the University of Seoul. He has served at a variety of advisory and civil servant positions within the South Korean government, including in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, MOFA, Ministry of Unification, and Ministry of National Defense. Thank you, and Dr. Kim, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I was very glad to have a chance to read the papers written by the two distinguished speakers, no offense. In this paper, Dr. Hacker explained more details about the lessons learned from the past, especially the cooperative threat reduction program, which was very, very informative. When dialogue with North Korea resumed in 2018, I also worked on a commissioned research project on the cooperative threat reduction program for North Korea. Because the cooperative approach includes many programs that includes not only eliminating strategic weapons, but also converting WMD production facilities and engaging with nuclear experts. So in my report back then, I argued that this cooperative program, which contributes to building mutual trust, has something that we have to consider. But I also highlighted that there are also challenges that may delay or obstruct the process that we want to pursue. First, it is very important to think about how highly North Koreans will value this cooperative program. Lessons learned from the former Soviet Union back in 1990s can tell us something, but those countries have been cooperative with the US because they already agreed to arms control and arms reduction obligations. So they saw the benefits of technical and financial support to help them fulfill their promises. And cooperative threat reduction can be viewed, in my opinion, it can be viewed as an attractive option after a grand bargain, political bargain is reached. The second point I would like to make is how to guarantee sustainable cooperation from North Korea even after a deal is made. It was not until 2007 that the US Department of Energy and DoD reached an agreement with Russia to gain even limited access to nuclear weapons storage facilities that had completed security upgrades with the US support. And another example is in Uzbekistan, non-proliferation program ended in 2008 suddenly because the level of cooperation was not sufficient. The monitoring portal and installations devices to detect WMD in the border area could be possible only to some places of this country. So another challenge is so-called salami slice strategy to exploit the benefits of this program. Russia attempted to dismantle aging weapon systems that were not within the scope of disarmament intended by the US. So in 1999, Russia attempted to disarm some other weapon system by arguing that CTR program should support the disposal of all aging submarines in addition to SSBN, for example. This has resulted in deepening distrust of Russia's intention, which was hotly debated in the US. And North Korea can learn what Russia did in the past as well. Third, it is also important to build sufficient infrastructure to support the conversion program. For example, advanced security equipment such as infrared sensors, security cameras, and alarm, and many others will be installed when the security facility upgrade project begins. But such assistance becomes useless if North Korea fails to provide electricity. If North Korea cannot afford the cost, then the question becomes who is going to pay for building all the necessary infrastructure. Fourth, coordination issue would be there for us to consider. Given that North Korea's first reactor is a Soviet model, Russia's participation may also be considered, and South Korea may want to present a new and modern research reactor design as a better option to replace the old reactor in North Korea. And China will also want to participate in dismantling and removing North Korea's missiles and other weapon systems, which were made with the help of Chinese supplies. So we have to examine the advantages and disadvantages of encouraging many countries to participate in the program. Perhaps participating countries can provide more funds to this program, but it is also possible that participating countries are likely to allocate the funds to high priority projects according to their own national interest. Then it will not be easy to coordinate different priorities among multiple actors. Fifth, we already talked about this issue in the first panel, but if North Korea is allowed to engage in peaceful nuclear activities, it'll be important to identify first experts who once worked in the weapons program and can engage in the new program for the peaceful use of science and technology. Then how can we obtain that information? Back in the 1990s, there were concerns about allowing monitoring, auditing, and access to the program, and also reluctance to expose their outstanding experts to the outsiders. So likewise, in the case of North Korea, there may be a great sense of reluctance, if you will, when the US tries to interact with people under the control, who was previously under the control of the North Korean regime. And on the US side, there were some skepticism also about providing shelter and other types of assistance, considering mission creep through the engagement program in the past. So assistance in the form of research fund, lab, and shelter that can be some incentives to North Korea, but it is no longer in the DTRA budget plan right now. So lastly, budget issue is very, very critical. The US government can use taxpayers' money for urgent threat reduction activities within 15% of the total budget for cooperative threat reduction. If negotiations with North Korea proceeds very quickly and urgent budget support is needed, then the US can use this money, but there are still legal obstacles as well, such as, for example, the Glenn Amendment, which bans the US support for countries that conducted nuclear tests in the past. There were times that the US government navigated such obstacles in the past, but that does not mean that it is not an issue at all. So these are the minor concerns that I have in mind. So I'll stop here and look forward to hearing thoughts from the speakers. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. You raised a lot of good points. Let's just move on to Dr. Huang in the interest of time. Dr. Huang?
Thanks a lot, Sumi. It's really my pleasure to talk about the North Korean issue on the same panel with Dr. Lewis and Dr. Hacker. And because Gina talks mostly about the Dr. Hacker's, the presentations, I would like to focus more on the Dr. Lewis, the paper on the energy-driven engagement on the Korean Peninsula. Dr. Lewis talks about the nuclear ambition and compares the South Korean case with the North Korean one in terms of, in terms of this nuclear ambition. But it seems to me, and I think the most Korean people would really think about that. And it seems to me that I'm wondering whether we can compare the North Korea and South Korea on the same level in terms of its motive, because the South Korean, the nuclear, the ambition was originated in the 1970s because of, the U.S. disengagement from the East Asia, the Nixon doctrine, and President Carter's plan of, the troops withdraw in the second the half of the 1970s. So this is quite different, Seoul's, ambition in nuclear, the weapons are quite different in the I can say that, this is mostly defensive, so it's quite a very somewhat different, from the Pyongyang's ambition in, developing nuclear weapons. And second, still, time difference, the South Korea's ambition was in the 1970s, so maybe the 50 the years ago, and then I haven't heard of any South Korean nuclear ambition in substantial nuclear ambition in recent period. Of course, many Korean peoples and even the Korean scholars talks about South Korea's own developing nuclear weapons, but the South Korean government has never talked about that. So it's 1970s, and then North Korea nuclear crisis has been developed since the early 1990s for the last 3 decades. So time period is very different. And also, I'm also wondering whether we can apply to the same approaches in order to resolve this nuclear crisis. That the United States put a pressure on South Korea in order South Korea to stop the nuclear weapons, but it's not working in the North Korean case. So I'm really suspicious about whether we can talk about the North Korean case and South Korean case on the same page, and also whether we can connect this question to the energy-driven engagement on the Korean Peninsula. My second question is also about the comparison between the South Korean case and the North Korean case. So you talked about the U.S. Success of U.S. strategy in South Korea and the failure of the U.S. strategy in North Korean case, especially. You talked about the two, the strategy, the proliferation-resistant technical choices, and also the effective safeguard measures. Clearly, it was really successful in the South Korean case, but it's really difficult to think about why this was a failure in North Korea. But it seems to me that the case of two Koreas are very different. So maybe the outcome was really difficult. So eventually, it was we can focus on the security, these maybe more than the technical issues. So North Korean issues also has much to do with the security needs by North Korea after the end of the Cold War for the last 3 decades. So the thing is that we need to start from asking the question of how to resolve the current nuclear issue in terms of its security needs, not the technical issue, or maybe the energy driven issues, something like that. So my another question about the security needs is that the changing, the security environment on the Korean, not only on the Korean Peninsula, but also on the global arena. After the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we are talking about the new Cold War situation, and in addition to the U.S.-China strategic competition and conflict. So the question is whether we are coming back to the colder period, then return. If we return to the Cold War period, that whether it will give us some influence on the North Korean issues, because the North Korean nuclear issue was originated from the post-Cold War the situation on the Korean Peninsula. So my last question is the policy implication. Where do we go from here? So as you said that the challenges are not the technical but the political. So the issue, what matters is how to resolve the crisis. Whether the role of IAEA is important now and possible. Of course, in the 1990s and the 2000s, North Korea, was not, the nuclear issue was not that military, but right now, it's, clearly the military issues. So there is some limitations that the IAEA can play a role in that situation. And I'm also some question about whether the JCPOA style agreement is possible, because the Iranian case and the North Korean case are quite different. Iran has never, conducted a nuclear test, but the North Korea has already conducted 6 nuclear test until 2017. So there are many differences in between the South Korean case and North Korean case, and also there's many differences between the Korean North Korean case and the Iranian case. So there's still many limitations and the difficulties in the understanding this case in terms of I think that in terms of the energy-driven engagement case on the Korean Peninsula. My short question to the Dr. Hecker, that he talked about the desirable the option and also the possible option, but I'm wondering what's the most desirable and the possible option on the Korean Peninsula, especially in the North Korean case. But I also think that it's really important to think about what is the most realistic option, the desirable and possible, and but also the realistic option in the North Korean nuclear test. Let me stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. A lot of good points raised by both Dr. Kim and Dr. Hwang. I was struck by also Dr. Kim talking about, just identifying North Korea experts, like how to obtain that information. I mean, as you know, I work in the intelligence community, so that's a very interesting point. She brought up budget issues, legal obstacles, reluctance by North Koreans. And then Dr. Hwang also talked about the differences between the 2 Koreas, between North Korea and Iran, the policy implications, where do we go from here? When, as Dr. Lewis said, the key challenge is really not being able to reach political accommodation. So what is realistically possible? Where can we go from here? Well, I will now turn to both panelists for their remarks in responses to the discussants' points. We do have a question that came in through the audience channels, and I'll just throw it out there in case one of you are also compelled to answer this question. The question is, there's a speculation that North Korea is set to conduct its 7th nuclear test. What is North Korea's goal by achieving this or doing this technically? That's also a question from the audience. So now I'm going to turn to Dr. Hecker first for your remarks, and then Dr. Lewis.
Thank you, Dr. Terry. Let me ask a procedural question first. how much time do we have? Because if we're going to end on the hour, that means we have 1 minute each.
We have few minutes. We will end a little bit, few minutes late, but you have maybe 4 or 5 minutes, 5 minutes each, let's say.
Okay. So let me actually go to this question that you asked from the audience, the test. Of course, there's going to be another nuclear test. I mean, North Koreans have very clearly laid out over the years how their nuclear tests are really integrated in their overall nuclear program. And so another nuclear test makes sense. And one can have all kinds of speculation as to what it's going to be. I won't try to engage in that at this time. If I were in their shoes, there are several tests that I would want to run. Let me go back, because the main questions and issues came up from Professor Kim. So Professor Kim, let me say, it's a great pleasure to find somebody in South Korea who has so much knowledge about the Russian-US cooperative threat reduction programs. I think that's great. It's a good thing to study, and it's a good experience to understand. What your comments make me think about is the following. Your comments were mostly addressing the experience in what I would call the Department of Defense part of the cooperative threat reduction program in the US. And what I was involved in mostly was the Department of Energy threat reduction program, and the so-called lab-to-lab program. And that I tried to capture in this 2-volume book that we call Doomed to Cooperate. And what you will find is those two sets of programs were very, very different. In the military end, there was a lot and a very adversarial relationship for much of that. So inspecting, their weapon storage sites and things like that, those were things were very, very difficult to do on the military end. On the lab-to-lab end, it was a totally different situation. The Soviet Union dissolved, in December 25th of 1991. 2 months later, I was in their secret cities in Russia. And a few months later, we were doing joint experiments behind the fence, so to speak, in the classified areas of Los Alamos, of course, doing unclassified work, or doing that work over there. And so those were very, very different experiences. And what your comments make me think about is one then has to take a look at what's the North Korean complex like? Is it more like the whole military situation, or does it also have a more scientific component? And certainly what's very different in Russia than is in North Korea today. The Russians, going back to Soviet days, had world-class scientists. I don't think the North Korea today has world-class scientists because they have not been able to be exposed and be involved in the rest of the world. And so I think when we design a cooperative threat reduction program, if we ever get that opportunity with the North Koreans, we'll have to keep that in mind. I certainly was encouraged by my interactions with the director of the Yongbyon facility and for his desire to do research, but we'll have to see how that goes. And the one thing that we learned definitively from that cooperation with the Russian nuclear scientists, they didn't want, going back to the previous panel, they didn't want to just focus on safety, focus on security, focus on nuclear safeguards. They knew those things were important. That's not where you build trust. The way we build the trust is we did scientific cooperation together. In other words, they want to see the cooperation to good, not just to avoid the bad. That's how cooperation has to be designed, and we were able to do that in Russia because of what they wanted to do. I have several comments for Jeffrey's presentation, actually, Jeffrey, but we can do those back home. I think you made some very, very important points about the technical measures versus motives and so forth. And comment to what's most realistic is we don't know. And actually, Kim Jong-un doesn't know what's possible. And so we have to continue to stay engaged, continue to update, continue to push, towards the cooperative mode in order to develop what will wind up to be the most realistic cooperation. I haven't given up on this cooperative conversion idea. Thank you. I'll stop there.
Dr. Lewis?
Yes. Well, just very quickly on the audience question to start with, North Korea has a lot of different things that they might wish to conduct nuclear tests to achieve. So it's quite a difficult guessing game because I don't think that they're planning just one more test. I mean, I think they probably have in mind a menu of tests that will play out over a certain period of time, that there are a number of potential objectives. So, North Korea is simultaneously at the moment both deploying tactical nuclear weapons to forward military units, which suggests a whole program of research, I think, for those warheads. But North Korea is also developing warheads for ICBMs that will be ultimately the ICBMs will carry multiple warheads. And so that suggests a whole other program of reducing the size of certain warheads. And so what they pick first, I certainly can't say. But just as a general matter, I would observe that there are things that they may wish to test for in order to improve the quality of the designs, whether that's making more efficient use of the fissile material that's available to them, or whether that's making the design itself more efficient, whether you want to make it smaller or more powerful. And the other thing I would say is that North Korea has really only conducted one test of what we think is a thermonuclear weapon at something like its full yield. And that's just not enough for reliability. I mean, the Chinese conducted a successful thermonuclear test in the 1960s, and then the one they did after that didn't work. Los Alamos was testing lots of thermonuclear weapons, and when Livermore went to test its first nuclear weapon, it got a disappointing yield. You can know what you're doing, but still need more tests to build confidence. So, I think North Korea's ambition is now much greater than it has been in the past, and that means that there are many things that they might wish to test nuclear weapons to achieve, and so that kind of changes how we think about what's next, right? We're out of the period where there's a logical next step for them. There are now, I think, many next steps. In terms of the general, I think the real point of disagreement between Dr. Huang and myself concerns whether one should do a historical and comparative case study to try to answer a question like this. And I just think as academics, we shouldn't be threatened by or afraid of making comparative analyses, particularly because a comparative analysis reveals the way in which situations are similar, and it reveals the way in which situations are dissimilar. Now, I mean, as it happens, I think that there's actually quite a lot of similarities in the two case studies. But I think at a deeper level, as analysts, it's a mistake to proceed with our analysis on the assumption that we're good and that they're bad, and that our purposes are defensive and that their purposes are somehow others. Because it's important to keep in mind that the North Koreans think that they're the good guys in the story. And the North Koreans think their weapons are defensive just as we think ours are. And so, I think when we're being academics, we have to set aside our personal prejudices. I mean, I don't want to live in North Korea. But at the same time, we have to set that aside and try to really look at the situation as it is with a great deal of strategic empathy and openness. And, I would argue that I think the two cases make sense together. The two programs start at the same time. And those two programs are interactive. What the South Koreans are doing matters to the North Koreans, and what the North Koreans are doing matters to the South Koreans. And in both cases, the United States is the primary interlocutor, particularly during the period in which the North Korean crisis reaches its high point. right? It's the United States, and the United States engages in the same strategies toward both countries. They work better in South Korea than they do in North Korea, and then the question is ultimately why? You know, the argument that I would make is what's so similar about the two cases, and what's really worth exploring, is that in both cases you have a government that is committed to a certain amount of technological development. There is a sincere desire, I think, in both cases for the energy benefits from this technology. And there is a certain amount of hedging toward nuclear weapons in the event that, you know, there are many costs associated with building nuclear weapons, and that causes both governments to hesitate. But yet both governments are interested in the security benefits and definitely engage in what I would call hedging. And the one place I would, you know, factually disagree with Dr. Huang is that South Korea's nuclear hedging continues. You know, that it continues into the 1980s and the 1990s, which, as I point out in the paper, is why South Korea is reluctant to sign the additional protocol. And once it does sign the additional protocol, very serious safeguards violations come to light, some of which were continuing into the early 2000s. And so this is not really a matter of something that happened 50 years ago. And it's true, we don't know if the Korea Atomic Energy Research Institute is engaged in hedging today. But I would think that would be a normal behavior. You know, I don't have a moral judgment about it. I just think that it probably makes sense to imagine that we see hedging behavior in most states, right? And that's, again, because there's a mix of motives at all time, and states are often seeking to keep their options open. What I think is then, again, revealing or interesting about that analysis is you can then start to tease apart, right? Why did South Korean hedging ultimately not result in a nuclear weapon, and why did North Korean hedging do so, right? And again, you know, you can read the paper, but the argument in the paper is it's not about the technical measures, right? The technical measures were sufficient in both cases to detect safeguards violations. They provided plenty of warning when North Korea really was passing into the period in which it wanted nuclear weapons. And so it's not that we didn't detect in a timely way, or that we didn't have the tools available to us to say that there was a problem. What we ultimately lacked in the case of North Korea was the political solution that would unlock the problem.
You know, thank you both again. As with panel one, I would love to continue this discussion and clearly debate. I would love to go back to our discussions too, but unfortunately, I think we're out of time. This just shows that there's just plenty of room for more in-depth discussions and debate on this topic. So with that, again, I want to thank our co-sponsor for this event, Dr. Lee and IFES colleagues, to Kayla Orta for all her efforts in spearheading this project, our Wilson Center IFES technical teams and colleagues, our interpreters, and all the panelists and discussants for this really excellent and I think thought-provoking discussion and debate. And to all who are joining us today, despite many different time zones. I know it's very late in Seoul, it's very early in the West Coast. So thank you, everybody. This will conclude our conference on avoiding meltdowns and blackouts, confidence building and inter-Korean engagement on nuclear safety and energy development. Everyone, please stay tuned for our forthcoming book. So this concludes our conference. Thank you.